All right, today I'm going to be talking about a very interesting topic, and it's going to be a return to just true blooded theology conversation today. And it's on the Incarnation and the miracle of the Incarnation, because I think it's one of the most under emphasized miracles of Jesus' life, because it is always overshadowed by the atonement on the cross. However, the Incarnation also did something amazing, and it dealt with, and it was necessary for our salvation in a way that, like the atonement was, right? Um, a point that I'll try to get to is I think there are two aspects of human behavior, and I bring this up a lot. There is our will and our bodies, and they're in some way distinct, right? Our will can become a slave to our bodies, and our bodies can become a slave to our will. And one of these relationships is the recommended biblical one. And in order to get that to work out, things had to happen because of the fall. So let's get started. First things first, what Jesus is, when we say Jesus got incarnated, the answer to this is, and so did Jesus, to what extent is Jesus God? And so how can he even be incarnated as God? If he is God, how can he be in a body? But what John clarifies is that Jesus is the Word. And what the Word is in Genesis, we can kind of look to this as John kind of throws us back here, is that when God creates, he is using his Word. So it's the part of God that is creative. It's the part of the world that gets filled and made in a certain way. And when God is speaking, it's always to help conform creation to his intention. So into the heavenly visions, right? So when God speaks and he gives us the law, so those are the word of God, the Bible as the word of God is the relationship was given to the Jews and to all of humanity to help conform their actions on earth to the heavenly Edenic vision. So when Jesus says that that man was not made for the Sabbath, but that the Sabbath was made for man, he means that these elements of the law were made to help humans conform to creation, and that Jesus, when he says, I am the law, or that he is the Word, he's also doing this. Right? So that's what we're looking at. When Jesus comes into the world, he's bringing creation back to this original creation intention. And so what we can say is the problem with our bodies in this creation intention, right? So when we were created with bodies. When we sinned, okay, we do something to our bodies, right? Their flesh is corrupted in a way by sin. Adam and Eve become ashamed of their bodies for the first time after they sin. When Adam and Eve, their first sin is embodied in an apple, and when they eat the apple and digest it, and when they eat it, it becomes a part of their body. The sin is related to flesh. And so when we transgress against God's order, there's this kind of unmaking of our flesh, or the corruption of our flesh. Okay? And in that sense, we're marked out as for sin or for death. Our bodies are by sin. Think about what happens to Cain after he sins. He's literally marked, and then he's exiled, and his relationship with the rest of creation is made shameful and harmed and hurt. Things that violate creation order are impure, unclean, and ugly. Is what's going on here. And so what you might even note is, and Gavin Orland has a great video on this, is that humans' free will is what created our sin, and it seems like there are other agents in the creation story other than God who also have this free will opportunity, and then could also introduce sin marks into creation. Things that cast them out and make them unclean through creation. And so, you might want to think of it like this, but when God makes the earth, right? He lets the earth bring forth grass rather than saying, and let there be grass like he does with other things, or when there's day and night, they're kind of described as natural consequences of the fact that he made the moon and the sun and things, and then there's like twilight are kind of worded in a way that makes these parts of things natural consequences of his creation that kind of play out. I think Gavin Ortlund even brings up in, I think, the Psalms, there are lines about the angels in the stars or angels as the stars. You can think of the earth here as an agent when it brings forth grass. And as we know from the story of Satan, a creature with free will that is not human, it can object to God's will and therefore curse itself and curse the things it touches and curse the things it creates, right? Jesus all the time points at trees or things and says, and this is, sinful and it will not bear good fruit. Things that are inanimate can be tainted by, and the fruits of the things that are bad can be tainted by the sin of their creation in a way, right? We inherit our corrupt flesh from Adam and Eve, okay? Think of the story of the Nephilim, right? They're these like superhuman beings that have free will to do things God doesn't approve of, and they corrupt the earth. And then the world that the Nephilim creates eventually gets washed clean and destroyed by water in Noah's flood. And then, this gets into questions of, was this all part of the plan? Like, it seems like these creatures are just doing things God doesn't want them to do. And I imagine Calvinists can kind of explain this if they want to, that there's something about allowing all of this to happen glorifies God because it shows how powerful he is, that he can overcome all of this. I don't know how much I buy that. I think it's more likely that we live in this kind of choose your own adventure book. So God knows all the endings, but that doesn't mean that God preordains which path we will choose along the way. But that's a complicated story, and I think I have sympathy for Calvinism, and I have a sympathy for Arminianism in this kind of thought, or what I would probably subscribe to would probably be Molinism in this kind of very technical way. But regardless of that, what's happening is that there are parts of creation that are unclean. Okay? Oh, one sec. Right, so think about the kosher laws. When God says, do not eat this, it's possible, this is not a dogmatic teaching, but think about it like this. Maybe the angel that made pigs or something like that said this is not, corrupted them in some way when they were made, and so now they're impure to eat, right? And that's what makes things impure and unclean. And that's why the Old Testament prophets have to do so much, and the priesthood to do so much to remain pure and clean. And that explains in a lot of ways the Levitical purity laws, right? And why things have to be clean and pure. Okay, so this takes us to the Incarnation. What the Incarnation does is it is the bringing forth of the purifying. So things that were impure before are being made pure and clean by his birth, or at least they're being redeemed irrevocably. Remember when I was saying before too, where it's like there were those like pigs or whatever, they don't have a choice. They don't do anything to become unclean. They just can't be eaten because of the consequence of previous actions out of their control. They have no free will to choose purity or choose impurity because of their background. This can also explain in a lot of ways, I think, why, for instance, the Egyptians, God makes them go into the water to drown and die when they're chasing after the Israelites. You might say something like, God knew they had no choice but to be evil, and that if they allowed, if they lived, it's possible they would have just been worse and all that stuff. So their death was acceptable as a creation remaking activity, right? Because they were so corrupted and they were so fallen that they didn't have basically the free will to choose good. But what the Incarnation does is it guarantees, if you want to think about it like this, the free will for all of these people to choose good, because it redeems material flesh. why Mary was a virgin is, and Saint Athanasius goes into this, right, a lot in on the Incarnation, which I'm stealing a lot of for this video and making it more modern, I guess you could say. And this specific video, it's got a great reader. He's got this great Southern accent. It's beautiful. Totally should listen to it. Maybe a Midwestern accent actually. But what he says is that the reason Mary had to be a virgin, it isn't because she needed to be a perpetual virgin. It's something like, if Jesus was made during the act of intercourse, the presence of God would have had been in that act in some way, and it would have been unclean because of the nature of the intercourse going on there, right? So what instead God does, God enters just a woman, period, and breaking the anatomical rules, I guess you could say, also just to glorify himself, right? Look, this is a miracle, one of many of Jesus's miracles, right? But it has something to do with, there are parts of the world that are impure that God has not yet touched, but he is about to, right? That's the point of Jesus. And so once he is born and incarnated, his body is redeemed. The body that he has is also the body that we have. The comparison Jesus makes is to of himself is the staff in Moses lifts up with a serpent on it to help the Israelites in the desert. Okay, and this is what he says. And no man hath ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man, which is in heaven, right? There's something about heaven has to come down so that we can go up, right? Something holy has to be in our world so that we can become holy. And as heaven lifted up as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Athanasius makes this comparison, right? The cross also brings Jesus up and out. He literally is extending his arms out. He's being shown into the world. He makes this analogy of him purifying the air, which I think is very cool, right? But it's something about Jesus' body entering the world, just the presence of it gives this light of life to creation, right? And that's why it being even held up, right, as a body is something that rededicates, if you will, all of the material world to this divine order. And it's an important step in the creation remaking process. And what I think we can think about with this now, to leave the Athanasius for a second, right? What we can think about is that for our minds, this is the, I think in a weird way you could even say the atonement did not convert C.S. Lewis, but the Incarnation. Think of the arguments, if you know C.S. Lewis's conversion story, that converted C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is told by Tolkien that Christ is kind of the myth that actually happened, and that really digs at Lewis. He kind of thinks about it like, well, what is a myth, right? If myths can actually happen, right, the kind of common perception of myths is that they're these fake stories we tell ourselves for cultural purposes, right? But what Christ is and what the cross is something that can be held up as a myth, right, that can fulfill these pagan archetypes. When Lewis infamously realized that he didn't have to say everything from the pagan world was condemned, and instead could be, Tolkien explains to him that the pagan world has these things called archetypes in them. And what we learn from Plato, and that this is maybe the sincerest contribution of the Greek world to anticipate the coming of Christ, is the idea of the Platonic ideals, right? So this is a lot, but this is gonna be a big part of this conversation. Plato basically says there are things in the world like a chair, but there's that perfect version of a chair, right? Isn't there? And maybe not all chairs conform to that perfect version. In fact, it's probable that none do by the nature of perfectness, but that doesn't stop there from being the ideal of a chair. And just because we can never experience it, it doesn't mean that it's not necessary to understand and have chairs. Chew on that for a second. Think about it like this. If we have warriors in our society, let's say, we will also have the idea of what the perfect warrior is. The Hercules, right? The Thor in our society that will animate all of the other warriors in our society to strive towards this point. It's the way I like to describe how when Jesus says that the path is narrow, right? It's like shooting an arrow from multiple places along a wall. Archers on a wall shooting arrows at one target. Even though they're all coming from different places, they're all aiming towards the same goal, and so they can all hit the target, even though the angle they're shooting at is going to be different. And so that's what these archetypes do in our society. They put these things up on high in our minds so that we can use our willpower to aspire to them, so that we can approximate them, even if we never succeed in fulfilling it. Here, right? That's kind of the Platonic ideals thing. And those archetypes that are representatives of supernatural concepts, that's what supernatural even might be, right? Above nature. The supernatural chair is the perfect chair on which all other chairs are relating to and to conform to, right? And that's why crosses are the top of churches. The cross, the atonement, the Christ spreading out his arms to welcome us, to redeem us, is the animating higher than high principle at the base of our communities and societies, and that we can all strive towards. Christ is like the archetype of archetypes of people. He's his body, literally on earth, that he embodied, can be the shining example for which our bodies might replicate. And that's what the martyrs are doing when they sacrifice their bodies for Christ, is that they're emulating him. And this emulation has a necessary social role. Without these archetypes, okay, we cannot have instantiation of anything approximating anything, really. In fact, these archetypes are so essential. If you think about lesser archetypes, Christ is the ultimate archetype of the human, right? There are sub-archetypes like the mother or the father archetype, right? And cultures use these archetypes to make their societies work. You'll find that if you look at whatever a culture's masculine stereotypes are, they usually complement that culture's feminine stereotypes. Because what they want to be happening in their society is men to start embodying this archetype, and then women to start embodying this one, and then they find out that they've gotten really close, and that when they come together, they can make a family unit. And what some people might rightly complain is that these restrictions are hard to conform to, and that they might seem arbitrary, and that just because the male archetype has something, that would necessarily exclude it from the female archetype a lot of times, because we're trying to do that kind of complementing thing where you need each other. And so you say, but I don't need anybody. I think this kind of instinct is where Satan pops in. You can kind of imagine this in the Screwtape Letters. We don't want to need other people. And these archetypes, they make us need other people because they're not complete. And so in a way, that is a big part of, I think, our society's problems. And I think there probably were very well-meaning Christians who did this switch where they said, what the only archetype we should be conforming to is Christ. Christ is complete. And so when we conform to the archetype of Christ, we will be totally complete and we won't need each other, right? But what that doesn't really understand is that even in the garden, in the Eden that we're trying to recreate ourselves, right? Christ in some sense is the new Adam. Adam and Eve needed each other, and that perfect complement of that was Edenic and also vulnerable. Being vulnerable is not a sin. Needing each other is not a sin. There is somewhere in the biblical architecture, masculine and feminine archetypes that we need. And what I think ended up happening is that all of the archetypes of the world, which we now call stereotypes for the most part, because there are also archetypes gone rogue, which are unnecessarily tyrannical and unhelpful, and we have programming in our bodies to get rid of them because those archetypes can become idols, right? So we have this kind of instinct to be very cautious about archetypes that we can sometimes entertain, and sometimes we don't entertain at our own peril. So we've kind of thrown off these archetypes, and then we forgot even what archetypes are. I don't think it's a coincidence that C.S. Lewis really likes the medieval world. Tolkien really liked the medieval world and Beowulf. And these older stories play with archetypes nonstop. And so anyone who's used to archetypal language, when they come across Christ, gets it immediately. You can look at this guy and you're like, oh my God. It plays into that system that I'm so welcome to. But what we're finding in our modern society is the very concept of archetypes is rejected. We do not want archetypes anymore. Films, books, the very subversion of archetypes is the goal, to the point where now subverting the subversion of the archetype is the place that we're at. All stereotypes have been flipped on their head so much that the flipped on the head stereotype itself has to be flipped on the head, because we cannot accept archetypes. And I think it's what leads to social confusion in a way, right? I think it's not a coincidence that in the era of destroying archetypes, we're also seeing skyrocketing divorce rates and things, because these archetypes are necessary for social function. And people don't want to socially function. They want to be completely independent on their own, and they don't realize that they need other people. They need archetypes, and the archetype they need most is Christ, and he actually happened. That's what's so necessary about the embodiment in the Incarnation, is that it is the necessary embodiment of the archetype, right, that actually occurred to redeem and to give us a sign, something to hold up, like Moses with the staff and the serpent, in the wilderness, to remind us where we're headed. And we need that. And that's what the Incarnation does. That is why, by the way, the Incarnation gets rid of all of these old kosher laws. The world, the material realm, has been redeemed. This is why Eastern Orthodox people believe we can have icons now, right? They might admit that in the Old Covenant this wouldn't have been okay, but something about Christ becoming a person changes the rules of material things, because we have brought the archetype of perfectness into the possible realm. It is now achievable for all of the embodied things in their own, by their own election, right? In a way that the atonement redeems our hearts and makes us right with God in a courtroom sense, the Incarnation makes us possible to even accept the atonement, in a universal way, because it's necessary that God intercedes to give us that free will. That's kind of the way free will seems to be going. It's right, I think, to say in the biblical worldview that God preordains everything, and that nothing would happen without the cause and effects set by God, right? That's basically the ontological argument, or the cosmological argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, right? But it also seems like, for instance, the Jewish people that God selects, he chooses out of the nations, he gives them the ability to choose him, and they fail, and he is disappointed, rightfully disappointed. So it seems like maybe they could have chosen to follow him. But what it says is that they needed a relationship with the Word, with Jesus, right? That's what is being happening when Jesus is the Word, right? Jesus is the Word is the law. So when the Jews are given the law, they're also given the ability to choose God and redeem their mortal bodies. And there's a lot of these rules that's necessary to even have the choice. And that's what happened in the Incarnation, and the physical world was redeemed. And so what I often think when I think about this, as someone who was raised Jewish, thinking about the Incarnation is so refreshing, because it kind of starts to make you think, if he had just done the Incarnation, if Jesus had just been incarnated, that might have been enough. That would have glorified God already in such a powerful way, with him redeeming the world, right, in such a powerful way, and we wouldn't have deserved anything more than that. It reminds me of, there's a prayer or a song that Jews sing on Passover about the other time God intervened to save his people from slavery and bondage to something. In the Passover, there's a song called Dayenu, which basically means, and that would have been enough, right? If he had brought us out from Egypt, this is the translation of the Hebrew, of course. If he had brought us out from Egypt and he had not carried out judgments against them, Dayenu, which means it would have been enough. If he had carried out judgments against them and not against their idols, Diana, it would have been enough. If he had destroyed their idols and not smitten the firstborn, Diana, it would have been enough. If he had smitten their firstborn and had not given us their wealth, Diana, it would have been enough. If he had given us their wealth and had not split the sea for us, Diana, it would have been enough. If he had split the sea for us but had not taken us through it onto dry land, Diana, it would have been enough. And it just goes on. And that's the theme of the song. And the incarnation is like that, right? Because you can look at this and you can say, wow, it would have been enough if he just redeemed our bodies, but he also redeemed our relationship in the atonement. And so I don't think we should allow the study of the incarnation, like I think people are concerned, potentially, that it will undermine the atonement. And I think that we should continue to emphasize the atonement, of course, but it makes the atonement that much sweeter when you realize that that God had already done something that would have been enough without it. Or not necessarily would have been enough. I don't want to overstate the incarnation, I guess, but I think you can't. I really think you can't understate God's love for us and that what the incarnation did. All right, thank you. So this was a great video back to theology and a little bit of culture and society in there. If you liked the video, be sure to like the video with the little thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe. Be sure to comment. Thank you so much for watching.